So I want to show some of the tricks I use when writing code that really smooth out the process of interacting with your code, interacting with Visual Studio. I plan on doing another one of these for Visual Studio Code sometime in the future, and perhaps a little look into the dev tools inside of Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. Lots of little tricks there that I use daily. Some of these I show in class, but I thought, based on requests from students, that having a little library of these things might be useful. A little video where you can go back and review and maybe just pick one or two things up and try to add it to your tool belt. So this is a Visual Studio 2019 project from a class I just taught on understanding and building ASP.NET Core Web APIs. And this is where we left off, just kind of getting the basic shape and the gist of how a Web API works. And I'm going to use some of these tools to refactor the code, navigate, etc. So one of the things you might want to do is in this controller, I'm doing direct access to the data context. And maybe I'd want to create a special service for that kind of wraps this stuff out up and takes it out of here. So eventually I would like to get rid of most or all of these service dependencies and just take a dependency on something that can actually get my books. This is for a fictional library. It looks up books, adds books, etc., etc. So I'm going to go to maybe one of these methods here. Yeah, this one that lets me get a book by ID. I'll start with this one. And this little bit of code right here, this is going to return a get books detail response. I'm going to say this should probably be in a service. So I'm going to cut that out and get books detail response, get book details response equals await. And here, I don't actually have this dependency yet. I'm just going to kind of write the code I wish I had. So maybe I wish I had something called book lookup, get book by ID. And I'll pass that ID in there. Sit back, take a look at it for a second. That looks pretty nice. That would be less of a clunker in my code. You know, you're kind of reading through. This keeps things at a similar level of abstraction. I think I like it. I like the naming. So I'm going to go up to the top and just kind of posit the existence. So down here, I created a dependency called book lookup. And I'm going to declare that up here. Maybe I look up books, book lookup. So shifted the error message up to here. It's saying this thing doesn't exist. I actually want this to exist within my services folder, perhaps. And then eventually we'll create a class that implements this. If I do hit the little light bulb, but control dot is so making sure I'm on the statement or the line of code here that actually has the error, hit control period, and it'll generate a namespace. It offers a bunch of different ways that can help you out. Generate a namespace, generate an interface in a new file. The problem with this is it'll put it in the controllers folder. I could tell it to generate this and it's actually going to put it in this same source code file. That's definitely not what I want. A nested interface will be declared inside this class. Again, not what I'm going for here. So if I do kind of the final, I don't know what to do, you tell me some more details thing here. If I do generate a new type, I'm going to tell it I want an interface in a new file, and I'm just going to copy that name because a little UI thing here is if I drop this down and say I actually want this in the services folder, it loses the name of the interface, so I can just paste that in there. I think I'll make it public because this is a public class and we're going to have it injected on the dependency, so it has to have the same access modifier. and hit OK. And you can see in my source code, it generated this interface. I look up book. If I wanted to go take a look at that just to see what it did for me, an easy way to do that is this code peek thing. If you hold down Alt and F12, yep, there it is. Take a little peek at this. I look up books, right? Public interface, not much there yet. So now I'm going to go down to my new error here, which says, yeah, there is a thing that looks up books, but it doesn't have this method. And once again, control period is your friend. So you do control period, and it's going to look at the usage here, and it can tell things like I'm awaiting this, so it knows it has to do this as a task. You may also know on my line 94 in the controller, I use the explicit type get book details response instead of var. That way it could, again, infer from usage what the task result should be here. Pick up to the parameter, okay. I think that's groovy, right? So that's a good way to kind of just generate these things. Now, obviously, if I ran this now and tried to get a book by ID, it would throw a null reference exception. So I'm going to add that to my constructor. That will be step one. Couple ways to do this. You know, this constructor is just a one-to-one mapping of my dependencies. So I could manually add a parameter and say set book lookup to whatever the parameter is. I could regenerate the entire constructor. So if I this case, it wouldn't be such a big deal if I just delete that constructor and do control period and do generate constructor. It'll ask me, I see these fields on your class. Do you want those to be provided for you through the constructor? And if I hit OK, it generated a new constructor that has that parameter on it. And that worked okay because there really was no code in here setting these things up. It was really just pass this in, assign it to the field, pass this in, assign it to the field. However, if I go back, you can also, on any one of these fields, just control period on that and add it as a parameter to the existing constructor. So add parameter, it adds that on and writes the line of code at the end to make that happen. So when I go to create a implementation for this, maybe I'll put that in my services. I'm going to add a class. I like to add, call the classes, name the classes after the technology that's implementing them. And in here I'm using Entity Framework, so I might call this EF SQL book lookup. And I'm going to tell this thing to implement I look up books. Now it shows an error there because this class doesn't fulfill that contract. It doesn't know how to look up books, but if I hit control dot again, it's amazing how far you can get with that control dot. It's going to generate the code to either implement the interface or implement the interface explicitly. For this one, I'm just going to implicitly implement the interface. Maybe at some point I'll do a short video on the difference between those two things. And there it is. Now it doesn't know how to do the actual work. I have that in my clipboard though. It would be something like, let's see if I can find it. I'm going to do if I do control V here, it's going to be just nonsense. So I'm going to do control shift V, and there it is in my clipboard history, the stuff I copied out a couple steps ago from my controller. Paste that in there and tell it to return the response. So a couple things are wrong here. I don't have a data context. I don't have my configuration for AutoMapper. And I have a wait here, but the method is an async. So I'm going to take care of each of these using some of these tricks as well. First one will be I need the data context. So I'm going to do a private read-only library data context. I'm using the camel humps technique here to filter the IntelliSense. In other words, just use the first letter of each word in uppercase. So there's my data context. I'm going to call that context. I'm also going to need the mapper configuration. So mapper configuration, hit tab, it adds the using statement for me. I'll call that config. And now if I generate the constructor, control dot, generate the constructor, it sets those. And here for the await, I need to make the method async. Of course, I could just go up here and type async, but I love my little friend control period. So control period, it will make the method async for us. And the very last thing is we need the using statement for get book details response. So what's the keyboard shortcut for that? No surprise there, control period. So the first one is actually going to be for project to, right? Because that was a extension method. So we got AutoMapper queryable extension. It added the using statement for library API models books. That's where this type is. And then finally, there's an extension method on system.data that adds the async methods to the data context. So control dot on that entity framework core. The last step, just for completeness, would be hook that up in my startup here as a service. So maybe, yeah, right here, I'll do this as a scope service. I look up books, EF books lookup. For more complete discussion of service lifetime managers, etc., I teach that in the class. I don't think I'll put that in the video now. But that's it. That's pretty good.